Hi guys, welcome to week 8 weekly reflections. I'm gonna go ahead and talk about a little bit of what I've read for this week. I'm gonna start off with the ADA and Compas Unit 9, Developing Relationships. Page 211 talks about the importance of understanding another person's journey. It mentions that we should invite students to read books that show the significance of other human beings. In page 217, it talks about grandparents playing an important role in people's lives or children's lives. Let me see. And how they've all and how children have I'm sorry and how they've often written books based on their experiences with their grandparents. So this was actually very touching, this chapter. Almost everyone has that special bond or had that special bond with their grandmother or grandfather. So it's nice that they're going ahead and talking about writing a book about somebody that means to you, somebody that's important to you, that has value in your life. And I think that's something that's very important nowadays. I feel that we don't stop and think about what we have or what we had. And it's nice that you can go ahead and write about it, reflect on what it is. And I think it makes you feel good. In page 223, it talks about how children can awaken in parents the most tender and unimaginable feeling. Like I said, honestly, this chapter was very, very touching. Talked about grandparents, which are always very emotional, especially when they're not here anymore. Talks about children, which, come on now, they're amazing little human beings that we bring into this world. So this chapter has made me actually reminisce, and has brought, happy feelings. It shows inspiring tips on how, to encourage your students to create books about someone who's influenced or who has influenced their lives. Whether it mentioned also about siblings, or children, grandparents, even parents, or even somebody that they haven't even met, maybe like an idol or a hero of some sort that they've read about or, idolized but never really met them. So in Unit 10, it mentions different poems about where you're from, and it encourages the teacher to share this kind of poem with the students, and then later it kind of tells them how to create a poem about where they're from. So writing a poem about where you're from, I believe is kind of like an icebreaker, for, an activity that you may be doing in the classroom, especially, and I've mentioned before in another reflection, I think it's very important to have that connection and communication with your students, not to get extremely personal, but I think that it is important for you to somewhat share something personal about you, like where you're from, where you grew up, how it was, or how it is. And I think that that's something that they can relate to and kind of open up, that via of communication to where they want to talk about where they're from, which I think is nice as well. So in Tabor chapter 7, using the curriculum to facilitate second language and literacy learning. So during activity time in the classroom, the children are exploring, learning about their environment. Let me see. They are engaged in hands-on activities and sharpening their social skills. So when they're in an activity time, they're able to communicate with one another, and that's why it's like kind of sharpening their social skills, because they're able to actually talk. It's not that they're doing work or a test in the moment where obviously they're not allowed to talk. So that's kind of like using like how it's titled, using the curriculum to facilitate their literacy learning skills. Let me see. In a teacher-directed activity, they mentioned a technique called running commentary or talking while doing, which means that the teacher is explaining the action of others while an activity unfolds. So this pretty much provides the second language learner like new vocabulary words to go with what is actually being done. So when the teacher is actually like kind of like a play by play, saying like, okay, so now we're gonna go ahead and use these purple scissors to cut that pink paper. Let me see how you use the purple scissors to cut the pink paper. I think it's kind of like repetition in the words, and they kind of put a name or a word to what is actually being done. Let me see where else. Oh yeah, reading. So, and also now I mentioned it's kind of like reading time. So reading a book out loud to children of both first and second language may be challenging. Sometimes, kids, I think for the most part, I believe that they do enjoy, reading books. But I think when you have different languages and different cultures in one same class, it's kind of hard to have those kids engage in that one topic. So it's very important, as it mentioned here, a couple of tips that it mentioned about reading books out loud. First of all, they need to be engaged in listening to the book. So keeping it short and simple is one way of capturing their attention. Talking the story rather than just reading it is also a valid technique. And this week, actually, the teacher that I work with, like I've mentioned before, I'm a substitute. So I was kind of like co-teaching with her for the past week and a half. And we did that like 2 or 3 times out of the week. We sat down, kind of like a circle time, even though it's first grade. And we read the book. Well, she read it, but the way that she did it was very good. It was a really good technique. Like she just didn't read, okay, this and this and this. No. Like she made it, I don't know, like enjoyable even for me. I felt like I wanted to know what was happening, what was going to happen next, just because she made it so entertaining. And in that class there is a handful of ESOL students, and I took a chance to look at them, and they were truly engaged because of the way she read it. She was making it exciting and fun for these kids, and that's what reading should be. It should be about that. So let me see. Outside time is also very important for second language learner, as they don't need to verbally communicate during that time, yet their social skills are sharpened and they are able to socialize because they're playing with other kids, and that's what they're doing. They're playing. So when you're playing, you don't necessarily need to talk. And I think that that's a form of them actually expressing themselves, by playing. I believe in setting a routine with repetition helps the second language learners as well. And mentioned in page 114, teachers may include songs and movements during circle time that reinforces their learning. So kind of like as we go back to the teacher reading the story to the students, I'm sorry, that can be part of the routine, and maybe even reading the book more than once, a couple of times in the week or a couple of times in the month, repeating it, they're able to understand and actually, learn it. So they begin to memorize the songs and somewhat find their voice, as it mentions in the book. In one of the handout that was in the Module 8 readings, it's called Language Teaching Methodologies or Approaches. I picked like 3 or 4 of them that caught my attention. So the first one is grammar, transition, method. So grammar produces the rules for putting words together. So, pretty much without grammar, can you really read it? Probably not. So it also mentions that classes are taught in the mother tongue with little active use of the target language. And it mentions that this approach provides students with good mental exercises to help develop their intellectual and academic skills. So pretty much what I got from this is that you're kind of teaching the students, well, that's assuming that you have an entire class that's, ESOL, right? but it's pretty much saying like to teach it in their mother tongue, and then little by little start adding the language that they need to learn. um, Another technique is called the silent way. It mentions that learning is facilitated if the learner discovers or creates rather than remembering what is being taught. So kind of like making memories of what you're teaching them instead of them memorizing it, which I found that to be a little bit interesting as well. So the teacher is actually silent most of the time, but they use colorful wall charts to kind of, I mean, displayed around the classroom or whatever to uh, to teach the students. Let me see. To teach the students like a lesson, rather than just talking about it or talking too much. Because remember, these kids, they could be a little bit afraid or intimidated by the language that they're yet to learn or that they're slowly learning. And I think bombarding them with a lot of these words and this language does scare them. And that will go back to what we learned in the last chapter or in the last week or the last module about kind of even refusing to learn the language because they're just scared or they just don't want to. Let me see. It says the teacher uses minimal corrective feedback. The next method is called communicative instructional settings. So input is simplified and made comprehensive by using context clues, props, gestures instead of structural grading. So pretty much you're using a lot of props, and it goes back to what I mentioned earlier about when you are discussing something, it's always good to kind of like repeat the word or the main word so they understand. I think I've even said it in another reading. Okay, so I'm going to talk about an apple. This apple is red. This apple tastes good. There are a lot of many different color apples, but I'm holding the prop. I'm holding the apple, and they already know that this is an apple. Children working in groups and pairs have the opportunity to respond to more questions, thus expanding their vocabulary than the typical teacher-fronted classroom with limited time. So when you're a teacher in front of, like it mentions, 30 children in front of you, you're gonna do the reading, but there's not enough time to answer all their questions because you have a certain amount of time in the classroom to do your lesson before you have to move on to the next. So I think pairing up the students in groups or in pairs, it makes it easier because among themselves, hopefully, they ask each other questions and they're able to interact. And the non-language speakers, paired up with the ones that do speak both languages, I think it's an advantage because they're able to communicate and share their thoughts and even learn from each other. In early ages of learning, there is little pressure to perform at high levels of accuracy and often a greater emphasis on comprehension than on production. Sorry. The teacher modifies their language to make it easier to understand for the entire classroom. So when I read this, I kind of thought like, okay, so we live in Miami. Yeah, I've heard teachers and I've been in classrooms with teachers that teach somewhat like in Spanglish. They say it in English and they say it in Spanish and then they mix it up. And I think that it's beneficial in our culture because there's honestly, like I've mentioned before, I was born here and there are some words that I do not know in English that I only know in Spanish. So I think it's easier. Imagine those children that were not born here, in the US and were born somewhere else. How hard it is if you're just sitting in front of the class talking in English and they're not understanding anything. The last one is instructional scaffolding. So we've talked about scaffolding before, which is where like an expert is kind of like teaching a person that doesn't know much. So, like a teacher and a student. So it includes teacher support, assisting students to relate new information to prior knowledge. So this kind of helps them if they know, if they make a connection, between the two, something that is new to them, but kind of making that connection with something that they knew before. And I believe this kind of method does stick, because if you relate, like I remember when this is my second career, but in my first career, I remember when I was studying for my boards, I used to like try and remember the information by making songs out of it. It sounds silly, but honestly, it worked, and I was able to pass. Yeah. Anyways, that's enough. That's it for this week's week 8. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next week. Bye.